his revelations about what was going on there. We know that also because Robert Hansen, who is perhaps the most notorious traitor to the United States in the last 10 years, was caught and convicted of treason. Robert Hansen was the guy at the FBI that was in charge of essentially watching money coming into the United States that might be used against the United States. And in particular, he had access to a program called PROMIS, which was the software that the FBI used to track monies coming in. He was convicted of selling this to the Russians. The Russians then gave that to Ayman al-Zawahiri, and that is what Al-Qaeda used to get money, men, and material into the United States to carry out 9/11. So current foreign policy, Foreign Affairs is their magazine. This recent article is critical. It talks about how foreign policy or the Tea Party can be marginalized, that they have control of several of the key members. He mentions in the article their control over people like Sarah Palin. And in fact, when you look at Sarah Palin's advisors in the 2008 cycle, Henry Kissinger was her chief foreign policy advisor. These are the best beginning resources. We'll talk about it. We're running late. Wanted to point out this. Some are concerned, geez, if we are starting to wrap our head around exactly what's happening in our government, well, we'll be marginalized, we'll be called kooks. You know, if we tell the truth, it will be horrific. These men and women are all members of the John Birch Society, have made it part of their life focus to expose the concealed enemies of our country. They include members of Congress, Governor Butch Otters, the current sitting governor in Idaho, flag officers like General Gatzis or Ward. Certainly this is not any kind of anti-Semitic thing, although certainly that's one of the smears that's happened. Andy Berlin, a friend of mine, is a Hasidic Jewish fellow in the Pittsburgh area. Reverend Stephen Kraft is a preacher in Harlem and actually runs a chapter of the John Birch Society out of his church in Harlem. There are solutions, but one of the key things that we have to understand is that there will be no responsibility at any level of politics until there is responsibility at the electorate level. So we have to understand that. And with that regard, we have a plan for victory. First, we have to inform ourselves on the principles and issues. We have to understand the enemy. The New American is a wonderful magazine. You've all got you know, some pamphlets, and there's some information on how to get to the New American and their website. One thing I would encourage you is go to the New American website, and if there's some you know, Republican candidate for president that seems real good, type their name into the search engine, and you'll see what connections they have, where their money is coming from, and who the people behind the scenes are that are driving that. We have to educate our friends and family to get involved and to understand what's happening in our country. We have to grow this movement based on our congressional district, to train leaders and build organizations that we can work on the district level to start retaking things, because we have to go after our congressmen. We have to either change their voting record or change who the congressman is. By that, we can then restore constitutional government and understand that we have to maintain vigilance for generations. That means we have to train our children to understand what's going on here. If we're able to push back and successfully restore the Constitution, if our children don't understand what that's all about, I guarantee you it will revert back to tyranny within a generation. So with that, I'll be happy to take some questions and answers. I know I've run long, and I apologize for doing so.
Back there. Not as quick.
Dirtbag Dick Cheney was the CEO of Halliburton before he became vice president, and when he became vice president, he pushed legislation through exempting all gas drilling companies from any responsibility from the results of their gas drilling. If you get a DVD called Gas Land, it will tell you all about how the gas companies are destroying our land, our water, and everything that's underneath the surface of the earth. The second comment is I'm positive on, you know, Kratz and Koch's list up there. I've seen those, that whole list under George Soros's Bilderberg group, and they're all after one world economy, one world government, and one world monetary system.
Yeah, in fact, there's a meeting of the Bilderberg group this weekend, in fact, in Switzerland, of great notice. You know, one of the darlings of the conservative movement is Rick Perry, governor of Texas. He's been out to Bilderbergers twice before and again this cycle, and was without question involved in that process as well.
Hi, very important lecture that we did today, so thank you very much. I have a couple questions. One, are you telling us that our supposed enemies like Russia, China, the Middle East are involved in this one world order?
Yeah.
Are they on our side?
No.
I mean, not our side.
Yeah. Yeah, and they're really controlled by Wall Street. There's a remarkable professor by the name of Anthony Sutton, who was a professor of economics at UCLA, was a senior research a guy at Stanford University. He's written a number of books, including Wall Street and the Rise of the Bolshevik Revolution, Wall Street and FDR, and you know, talking about aid and trade to the Soviet Union, how there were these massive technology transfers and cash infusions. In the, I think it was late 70s, early 80s, Russia built one of the largest, most modern truck factories then existing in the world, which was a huge boon to their logistics supply for their military. That was financed by Chase Manhattan Bank. And so that's, and he's great at following the money, and was really one of the chief pioneers of the field of forensic accounting, to actually go back and look at where this money is coming from. So Anthony Sutton, you know, a good name to Google and some information to get towards. Another great example I can give you is in 1964, when there really was this push to end, you know, the Soviet menace and usher in this perestroika and glasnost movement. The idea of Khrushchev doing that was impossible. I mean, here's a guy who was beating his shoe on the table and saying, "We will bury you," and all this kind of stuff. And so shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's this rather celebrated incident where David Rockefeller gets on his private jet, flies over to Moscow, lands in Moscow, the red carpet's rolled out, the marching band comes out, he goes to the Kremlin, he's in the Kremlin 3 days, media blackout, nothing's happening. He leaves, and within a week, Khrushchev's out and Brezhnev's in. Well, I've got to tell you, that gives you a pretty good idea who the boss is. And that money flows back. Again, I only say follow the money, because that will really give you a good idea of who's driving the train on this.
I have just one more quick question. We think that Fox News is the friend of freedom and liberty, or are they actually part of the one world order?
Absolutely a part of it. And I'll give you, you know, an example. Rupert Murdoch, the CEO of Fox News, is in fact a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And it's part of the controlled opposition concept. Now let me give you this example. If you had a sealed container of water and you put that over flame, well, it would boil, and if you didn't have any release valve, it would explode on you. But like a teapot, if you have a little release valve for the excess steam, we can boil that water all week, and you're not going to have a problem. And that's the same concept that comes into play. So you'll have that release valve for the steam, and allows you to continue the process very effectively.
Okay, we got 2 more questions, and that will probably do us for the day.
And I'll be happy to stick around and ask some other questions. If you don't get an opportunity, I'll be happy to stay around.
Where's China fit into with all of this?
Well, you know, and it's a good question because, in fact, the reason why the John Birch Society was started was over the China issue. There was a movement right at the end of World War II to betray Chiang Kai-shek, who was very much a friend to the United States, and support Mao Zedong. And there was this concept that, oh, Mao is not a communist, he's an agrarian reformer, and all this kind of stuff. Well, that was nonsense. The guy was a known communist. And it was a result of the State Department's active participation in betraying Chiang Kai-shek and promoting Mao Zedong that got a businessman like Robert Welch, who was founder of the society, to really start understanding that we're not just talking about communist infiltration overseas taking part of this, we're talking about active American efforts to push this agenda. And that was why he started the John Birch Society, to expose what is happening in our own government and in our own country as the aid and push to that. So for an absolute certainty, China would not be Red China today if it hadn't been for the active involvement of the United States in pushing that agenda. And they're absolutely controlled by the same financial sources.
Okay, last question right here.
Yeah, just real quick, you had mentioned a website where we can go and put in a politician's name to find out where his money backing is coming from. Would you repeat that website?
Certainly, it's thenewamerican.com. The New American magazine is a magazine published by the John Birch Society, and they've got a website with a search engine, and so you can put in you know, Alan West, and you can put in Mitch Daniels, and you can put in you know, Chris Christie, and those kinds of things. And it's really critical because, like, for example, I know in a lot of conservatives, somebody like Chris Christie is like, oh, he's like the darling of the conservative movement. But when you do some research, you find out, you know, he's totally anti-Second Amendment, that he's for open borders and amnesty for illegal aliens and all this kind of stuff. And I mean, it just becomes, you know, really rather shocking.
Where do you go to find out who isn't?
Well, you know, and again, that's one of those things where you've got to follow the money. I mean, from my own personal experience and the sort of list of guys that are running now, when you look at the money, there's really only one guy that isn't on the take, who's Congressman Ron Paul, which is sort of problematic. I mean, for me personally, this idea of advancing the homosexual agenda, I think that goes right to the ecclesiastical aspect of destroying our culture, and you know, I think that's really problematic. Issues about you know, drug use and that kind of stuff. You know, I agree with them. The federal government's got no business in it because it's not in Article 1, Section 8. But I can tell you, as a prosecutor, drug use is a problem, and the state has a reasonable interest in making those things illegal and you know, trying to protect society on that basis. But he's right on the Federal Reserve. He understands the financial disaster that we're going for, and he has a correct understanding of foreign policy within the guidelines. And most importantly, he's not on the take from the Council on Foreign Relations.
Okay, thank you, Robert.
Thank you all very much, and again, I'll be happy to stick around and take some more questions. I'm sorry I didn't want to.
Oh, that's okay. It was a very good presentation. It's kind of funny because about 15, 20 years ago, John Birch Society had a little bit of a bad reputation, media generated, of course. And I thought to myself at the time, well, you know, they can't be all wet, because what they're describing is normal human behavior. Farmers try to influence things to promote agriculture. Lawyers try to influence things to promote lawyers. Of course, bankers are doing the same. And what I was missing was, well, who is this bad guy out there that is doing all this manipulating? Well, now we know exactly who George Soros is. And thanks to the internet, we know who George Soros is meeting with over in Switzerland this weekend.
You know, I take, you know, when I was, you know, being looked at and was looking at the John Birch Society, one of the key things for me is, if you look at who the left demonizes the most, over the last 50 years, without question, it's been the John Birch Society. And I'll tell you what that means, it's the most effective organization at the national level, because they wouldn't attack it if it wasn't the case. So.
Interesting point, because I often say, we need to look at who the media vilifies the most. That is our candidate for president.
That's right.
But anyway, thank you, Robert. I appreciate everybody coming and sticking around for this. We got the donate bucket out there if you want to help us out with ink and paper. And we wish everybody a great weekend. Thank you.